So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Prescribed Burn Permits and Process. My name is Margot Rollins, and I'm the program coordinator for the Galbraith Wildlands Preserve in Yorkville, southern Mendocino County. Galbraith is one of 3 nature preserves owned and operated by Sonoma State University's Center for Environmental Inquiry, and I'll be the host for this evening. This presentation is the 3rd arm of our 3-part series, Good Fire. And it is provided through a generous contribution grant from the Mendocino County Fire Safe Council. The first presentation, which was also on Zoom, was held on March 28th. Our presenters at that were Sasha Berlin of Audubon Canyon Ranch's Fire Forward Project and Andreas Avila, the fire chief of the Anderson Valley Fire Department. At that presentation, they walked us through a variety of real scenarios in which a prescribed burn might help a landowner meet his or her management objectives. This event was recorded, and you can view it at cei.sonoma.edu/rxburn. I'm going to send all of these things to you all afterwards in an email, which will help you keep track of all these different URLs we're going to be providing you this evening. The second portion was scheduled for April 13th, but rain forced us to reschedule that for May 19th. It will be on the Galbraith Wildlands Preserve, and we will physically walk through various scenarios and landscape settings under the leadership also of Sasha Berleman and Angela DeWitt, who is the training officer for the Anderson Valley Fire Department. This portion is sold out, but you can email me at rollinsm@sonoma.edu if you wish me to put you on the wait list. Again, I will send that to you in an email. Before we begin with our presentation tonight, let me just tell you a few things about the Center for Environmental Inquiry. We are a center located at Sonoma State University with the objective to empower students of all ages and disciplines to solve the environmental challenges of the North Bay. We're trying to do this by turning education into action. And we provide direct outdoor learning experiences on all 3 of our preserves. Galbraith, I've mentioned to you a minute ago. The Osborne Preserve is on Sonoma Mountain and Rohnert Park, and our 3rd one is Los Guilicos, which is in Kenwood. We provide classes, workshops, do public events and tours that focus on experiential learning and skill building. In addition, we make the preserves open to anyone who is interested in education, research, or inquiry, creative inquiry. We also invest in real-world projects, working with water issues and fire, the particular focuses that we're working on right now at the center. Our presenters today are Mike Jones, who is the Forestry Advisor for Mendocino, Lake, and Sonoma counties at the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources, and Chair of the Mendocino County Prescribed Burn Association. Joining him will be Kyle Farmer, who is another member of the Mendocino County Prescribed Burn Association's steering committee, and Kyle will talk to us about his personal experiences on his own land going through this process. Mike has envisioned this as a very interactive workshop, and he'll start us off with a few basic bits of information and share some websites that would be instructive as you pull together your prescribed burn plans. Most of the time will be spent with your questions and answers. This is being recorded, and in that email I've mentioned, I will let you all know when it is available for viewing. And finally, would you all do me a big favor and put your name and where you are located, whether that be like several of us in Yorkville or wherever that is, put your name and where you are in the chat. And with that, Mike, you can't take charge because I have not given you that power yet. So hang on a second, which I will do if I can find you.
All right. Well, I'll just start with introductions and then.
Now you can share. Now you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, good evening. Thanks y'all for being here. This is going to be pretty informal. I guess just a quick poll, either by raising your actual hand if your computer's on or your camera's on, or your digital hand. But how many people here have done prescribed burning before and have navigated the permitting process? Besides Kyle, and I know Nancy, you probably permits and basic air quality. And Gabrielle, you're working on it, so I know you're like in that process. Okay, cool. So
do you want to start out with just, I want to like work through questions that y'all have or issues that you might have had navigating the process, and then really rely on yours experience and bring in folks who maybe have had success or challenges and just talk about it in a more open kind of conversation. But I do want to start out by just reminding folks where resources are located and how to access them. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. Okay, so the first place that I would recommend if you haven't really engaged in prescribed burning in any capacity is to start with the California Prescribed Burn Association website, right? So this is not just a resource for PBAs. If you are looking to burn using community resources or working through the community, but we're building a repository of information. And kind of a nice place to start, if you look at kind of these tabs, is planning a burn. And it kind of goes through the steps of how you would engage in prescribed fire, including like communicating with your PBA community, how do you get help, and then writing a burn plan, which is your very first step, is kind of identifying, just like any other type of management practice, you would want to start with a plan, a broad plan to identify your goals and objectives and the tools you're going to use to achieve them, and how you're going to monitor and ensure that you've achieved them. But then as you work down, you're going to decide what permits you need, right? And so that's a big challenge. It can be fairly complicated in some instances, trying to figure out how to navigate the permitting process. I don't think that's unique to this issue. That's pretty common for a lot of the natural resource and stewardship practices we have in the state. But so this is a good resource. Start here. I would definitely recommend kind of looking through the information available on the Cal PBA website. Not only does it have information about planning burns, but we have information on different types of burns and resources available. So examples of burn plans and smoke management plans and some other things that might help you in that process. And then also connecting with your local PBA. So where are there PBAs in the state, and how, if you click on them, I don't know if they're down here, if you click on it, how do you contact them, and how do you find out more about that program that has to offer? All right, so Cal PBA, good starting place if this is a brand new process for you. If you're going to burn in California, you need to work through CAL FIRE. CAL FIRE is the agency, the organization that kind of oversees lots of natural resource management in the state, especially if you're in state responsibility area or SRA, you're going to need a CAL FIRE burn permit. If you're an LRA or local resource area, you need to talk to your local fire district. But
do people know what that means,
have to talk
Michael?
to some fire.
Mike, do people know what that means? Do people know what that means? What you're
Sure.
talking about?
Sure. So let's just go into it. CAL FIRE has actually done a lot to update their website, so it's a little bit more user friendly than it has been in the past, which is, if you can believe it, is amazing. So they have they actually have really nice kind of process. This step 1, 2, 3 that they've outlined here is for residential, the biomass you create from thinning in your defensible space and general yard maintenance. But my computer is telling me my internet is unstable, so I apologize if I drop off again. But you have to check whether or not you're in local responsibility area or state responsibility area. And CAL FIRE is a nice map, and hopefully this loads, that will actually tell you where your property is located, whether or not you are in either of those jurisdictions. If you're a local responsibility area, LRA, then you need to contact your local fire district for information about obtaining a burn permit. If you're SRA, then you need to contact CAL FIRE, either directly through your local battalion chief or going to this website. And it's just their response. Oh, it's nice. Burn permit responsibility area viewer. They're getting their act together. So if we zoom in to Mendocino, do they have a key? That'd be helpful. Well, it doesn't say what color, but I think yellow is probably is SRA. So as you can see that like most of the county, Mendocino County and a lot of the counties is SRA. So pretty much all of us are going to fall into that, unless we're in the city limits, are going to fall into CAL FIRE's administrative responsibility. So that's just a nice map they have here. So if you want to do residential burning, that permitting process is called an LE6. Maybe a lot of you have already done that. It's pretty easy. But if you go to the bottom of the page, they have these two options right here: a general burn permit, which is an LE5, and that's just their nomenclature, right? It doesn't really matter too much, you know that, but that's the general burn permit they call within the agency an LE5, and that's required for pretty much all kind of small burn projects that are larger than residential burns, but smaller than a large acreage prescribed burn, right? And so that includes pile burning, and you can see the kind of outline agricultural projects and small broadcast burns. So things that are usually a couple acres in size cumulatively. So that is a permit that you will need pretty much for everything that we will do in the prescribed burning kind of framework. If you go larger, so if you're burning large acreages, either contiguous or cumulative acreages, and or large volumes of fuel or biomass, then it's going to trigger this much larger permit, which is called a broadcast burn permit. This is a LE78. And basically what CAL FIRE is saying here is, hey, you're burning a lot bigger of an area, maybe in a really a more dense type of fuel or vegetation type that could presumably have different fire behaviors. And so they're going to require this additional level of permitting and processes to make sure that they are comfortable with your preparation for that burn. And so it requires an additional level of process and site visits with CAL FIRE. And from what I've been hearing, that they're also requiring site visits from the local battalions, even for LE5s, and it kind of changes. So it's really hard to keep track of these changes. So I'm going to generally talk about these resources, but always check with your local agency or your local CAL FIRE battalion before you start anything, because they could change. It really depends on the interpretation of a local battalion or changes that are being made in the spur of the moment at the state or the regional level. So always check with folks before you start the process. But this just requires a level of investment that you're going to need to go through. It's just kind of best management practices, and for CAL FIRE to feel confident in your ability to successfully do these large scale burns, they're going to need to do some site visits and kind of have some conversations with you. So these are CAL FIRE permits. Anybody have any questions about this? I was going to say if anybody's been through this process, but let's get through the last big category, which is air quality permits, and then we can kind of talk about our experiences with these. Be aware that May 1st is typically is an established deadline for open burning. I don't know, that's not the right term. Permissive burn days. So that means that May 1st, on basic pile burning and things like that will no longer be allowed without going through the rigorous permitting process and getting additional permissions from CAL FIRE. And then at some point they will establish a burn ban completely, because we'll entered in a wildfire season, and then because they won't have the available resources to staff prescribed burns if they were to do that, or to respond to escapes that happen from prescribed burns or pile burning, then that's why they don't allow any more burning, even permitted burning during wildfire season. So it's kind of tricky. It's very fluid. It depends on how the fire season is shaping out, resource availability, kind of how CAL FIRE perceives risks. So it changes from season to season. So within the year, and even within those different seasons, it can change kind of based on the needs and the CAL FIRE's, perception of risk. But I see, Lawrence, do you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I had a question. Where would we go for information as far as tribal lands? About half of Round Valley is tribal, not privately owned. Most of the privately owned is LRA. And if you get out of the valley, it's SRA. But
so that tribal lands,
is there resource available? Is there websites, etc., for tribal?
So great question. I was gonna try not to, not really. Tribal lands fall under federal responsibility. So typically under the BIA, and it gets complicated because there's multiple different types of ownerships under tribal lands. But typically the Bureau of Indian Affairs tribal land, and they have a completely different process of permitting burning. It typically is collaborative with the LRA and SRA, you know, the people responsible at the local, state agencies, but it requires a different level of permitting and engagement processes. However, the state is changing that, right? If it's a cultural burn and it's led by tribal fire practitioners, there are some ways to work around the rigorous permitting processes. But again, they're morphing and changing, and I can't say I know a ton about where we are right now with that, to be really clear, but I know it can be fairly challenging on tribal lands, especially when there's the you know, the multiple sovereign lands versus federally leased lands versus private lands. But unfortunately, I don't have a lot of resources to help in that space, but we are trying to kind of figure out how to make resources more accessible to those communities as well.
Well, Mike, do you have any suggestion of where somebody would start to inquire how to do this?
For private land or tribal land?
No, on the tribal lands.
Well, it typically, in our experience, and it's limited at this point, but it requires, you know, it starts with the, you know, it starts with that communication with the tribal government, and understanding kind of their needs and interests and what relationships they have with BIA, and then communicating with the local BIA representatives to understand what their expectations are and what they would need or feel comfortable with before a project move forward. So it's completely depends on each tribe's needs and the resources available to them, and BIA's kind of interpretation of the rules and that process. So I don't really have a very clear kind of trajectory for how burning with on tribal lands works, because it very much depends on across each community and kind of the federal government. So it's not a very easy process at this point.
But you did give them an idea of where to start. That's the main thing. With BIA.
Yeah, usually you would start with the BIA representatives and kind of, yeah, that would be the go. But like I said, because the state is changing, you know, they have changed too, the rules around cultural burning. They have made it a lot easier to implement burns, and a good entity to talk to and learn about how they navigate this process would be the Tribal Eco Restoration Alliance in Lake County, TERRA, and they've been doing a lot of prescribed fire, cultural burning, and prescribed burning with the community and with the federal government and with local government and CAL FIRE. So they definitely have found pathways that's worked for them. That is maybe not necessarily accessible to the private landowner, but has worked because they're in a tribal organization and have had built this community relationships. So talking with them would be a great place to start with understanding some of the challenges and the needs for burning on tribal lands.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, it's not, you know, we're not at a phase where everything's just like nicely wrapped up and I can hand you a package and a booklet and say, here's the process. It's still very much a learning process for all of us. So these are the two, right? The LE5 and the LE78 are the two big permits that we deal with for prescribed fire through CAL FIRE. And remember, if you're on LRA, then you would need to talk to your local fire district to see what kind of permitting they might require. And then the last big permitting organization that you need to talk to is air quality. Unfortunately for us, Mendocino County has a pretty supportive air quality district, and they have been really supportive of prescribed fire. For any project, you need a burn permit, right? A day of burn permit. So today is a permissible burn day, as they state on the website. And then they say you need to get a burn permit, which is a pretty straightforward application. It's $19. And you say, I'm going to burn today, and here's all my goals and objectives. And here's, I'll stop ignitions whenever you say, and all that stuff. If you're going to do a larger burn, then you need to do this smoke management plan or SMP burn request. And what this says is, I'm doing a big burn. I have my smoke management plan in place, which I'll mention in a second. And you're just going to request the burn on that permissible burn day, typically for a large project. What a smoke management plan is essentially it says, hey, I plan on burning a lot of acreage. I'm going to produce smoke. And because air quality is worried about the impacts from smoke, you're basically going to identify where you're burning, the types of vegetation you're going to burn, where sensitive receptors or, the community like schools and hospitals and people who might be at risk for smoke, where they're located and how you're going to mitigate that potential smoke risk. And that's basically what that document says, is you're telling air quality like, hey, I'm going to burn, but I'm going to make sure I do it in a way that I'm not going to impact people who are sensitive to smoke. So this is just to say I'm going to burn, and here's my S&P. If you go to the burning tab on the Mendocino air quality, you go right here. And this is this tells you all about it, and then you can apply for one. So it's pretty nice and pretty straightforward and convenient. I don't remember the exact cost. I think it's like $119, and they're good for 5 years. But basically, these are the big reasons why you're applying. Like I'm burning at different outside of the permissible burn window, which is during the day. I'm burning for large acreages or high amounts of fuel load, right? So 50 tons, or I'm going even really bigger. I'm going 100 plus acres. So that's kind of when this kind of permit kicks into place. I know, don't stare too hard because it's going to make you dizzy, but I'm just wondering if I can see if the price is listed on here. I remember it being like 117 or 119. I don't see it. Okay. And if you're not in Mendocino County, then maybe you're in Northern Sonoma County or you're in the Bay Area Air Quality District, but each air quality district has their own permitting structure, their own interpretation of the rules, and their own fee structure. So you definitely need to check with air quality before you burn to understand their process, the fee structure, and what you will need to go through that. Whereas CAL FIRE has very consistent permits across regions and their units. The air quality districts are very, very highly variable from air quality district or management district to air management district. So be aware. Mendocino has been very, very, very supportive and has helped us a lot in getting prescribed fire and prescribed burning done. Northern Sonoma Air County Air Pollution Quality Control District has been supportive, a little bit more expensive, but the Bay Area Air Quality Control District is a lot more challenging because, well, they have a lot more things to consider and worry about as far as pollution, and smoke just adds one more risk to that list. So they're a little bit more hesitant and can be a little bit more challenged. But definitely make sure you check with your air quality district first before you think about what kind of burning you want to do and what the fee structure and the requirements are. So that's basics, right? Start with Cal PBA. What's the burn process? We need a burn plan. We need probably burn permits. We need air quality permits or smoke management plan. And those are the big hurdles to kind of implementing prescribed fire, at least the permitting structure. Like I said, the interpretation changes pretty frequently. So with CAL FIRE, it can change from between seasons, but then within seasons, things can change pretty rapidly and be more, you could think you have an understanding of what they require, and then they might change their interpretation, or you might get a new battalion chief and things change once again. So always kind of keep checking back and make sure you understand what is required or expected of you. And same goes for air quality districts. So that's the big overview. Are there any questions, or does anybody have any specific issues they've been dealing with or interests that they want to talk about? I'm open to any kind of conversation. This stuff is, it's a little, there's a learning curve, right? There's a hurdle to get kind of over that initial phase of understanding these permits and how to navigate them. But once you figure it out, I think you're pretty good. You just got to make sure you keep up on those changes and requirements in CAL FIRE and air quality. But once you figure it out, it's pretty streamlined and it gets pretty easier. And the Prescribed Burn Association, we have some capacity to help folks. Like I can help. We can help you through the burn planning process. We can't really apply for permits for you or doing that stuff, but if you need help navigating them or kind of developing your burn plan and figuring out how to get through this process, we can certainly, reach out to us. We can certainly help in that process.
So Will's raised
Will, you
his
have a
hand.
question? Yeah.
Yeah. if your project, say, is close to Highway 101 and there's a chance like the smoke is going to go across the highway, like do you have to do extra permitting or anything for that?
Well, CAL FIRE may be a little bit more hesitant to approve that kind of project. We have done burning right on Highway 101, and what we did was since we had CAL FIRE support and some people in the PBA were part of were retired CAL FIRE, we kind of used those connections and had CAL FIRE folks reach out to Caltrans and the sheriff's, or not sheriff, but CHP, and we got the message boards. We got them to say, hey, we're hosting a prescribed burn on the freeway, watch out for smoke. And then we had to be really clear in our burn prescription that the mixing height, so the smoke would lift up and disperse and not push across the freeway. So we had to prove that we were burning on a day where we would not produce tons of smoke that would create a visual hazard for drivers. So yeah, that's more challenging. I think burning in areas where you can impact traffic, especially on a freeway, are things that CAL FIRE is going to be scrutinized more. But if you have a proven track record and you have the right players like Caltrans, so you can get signs put up, or have awareness that they might be more open to allowing those kinds of projects. But there isn't an additional level of permitting that I'm aware of, and so it's just kind of up to the discretion of the local unit and their comfort with the fire practitioners.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I like working with small departments and stuff. I've seen we have flaggers, right? You put like prescribed fire up ahead and don't call 911, all that kind of stuff. And then you have flaggers on the road to get people to slow down and make sure they're aware that, hey, we might put in smoke on the road temporarily, and not to get too concerned and help them through that. So it depends on the scale too, right? The kind of impact that you might have. A freeway is one thing. It's small community roads where there's a less frequent traffic or another. Peter.
Yeah, just a quick question. Does the permitting apply for pyrolysis? If I'm doing like open gasification and I'm not throwing embers?
Can you define that, Mike? Can you define that for the rest of us? What is Peter talking about?
Pyrolysis is kind of like combustion, right? It's the conversion of gasification, or the conversion of matter through superheating. I'm sure maybe Peter, you could elaborate on that more. But so Peter, for example, you know about air current burners, right? Like the big burn boxes that have air curtains and are pretty control spark arrest pretty good, or kilns like biomass kilns. Even those do a pretty good job of controlling ember production. They still trigger the burn permitting, the burn permit process. Wow, that was a mouthful. And CAL FIRE considers the risks from current burners and kilns and other types of projects that produce heat and the potential for fire risk the same way. Air quality also does not have a way of differentiating out, unless they change. They also don't differentiate different types of burns. It's just if you're burning material or superheating material, they consider all kinds of same risks. So at this point, no, we do not differentiate types of projects, though we need to, right? Because if you're burning in your pyrolysis, you're in a closed environment, you're an air current burner or a kiln, the pollution and the risks are completely different than open pile burning. So unfortunately, we're not at that point yet.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, there's a question from Kristen in the chat. She says 4x4 seems small for a pile. Mine are much bigger. Do I need to break them up? And then how much space should there be between piles?
Oh, great questions. We do a pile burning workshop in Extension, and if you're really interested in it, I can pass you my colleague's contact information. Kyle, if you want to give feedback or input, let me know. But 4x4 is the rules, and if if CAL FIRE, if you're getting an LE5 permit, a burn permit from CAL FIRE to burn piles, and they come out and do a site inspection and they find that your piles are much bigger than 4x4, they might have a problem with that, right? And as far as spacing out, they need to be far enough apart that they're not going to catch sparks. I don't know if there's actually a rule on their distance, but they need to be far enough apart that they're not going to catch sparks from neighboring piles if you're not igniting them all at once, and that you can have defensible space around each pile. That being said, I don't always see big distancing spacing between piles, but they need to be constructed in such a way that you can safely burn without presenting too much risk and overwhelming yourself, right? So it's kind of what's your capacity and what kind of resources do you have available. Kyle, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, is the mic working from my phone?
Yes,
Yeah.
you're fine,
Yep.
Kyle.
Okay. Yeah, 4x4 is always kind of a joke. Everybody jokes about how small that is. If you really want to follow that rule, one thing you can do is pull a small 4x4 off and then add to it. Either with an excavator arm or just by hand. That also can be a good way if you forgot to tarp your piles. As long as you have one good dry pile, you can often add to it that way. And as long as your starting pile is 4x4, then you're technically have a 4x4 pile, as far as I understand the way it's written. Because you can also start a 4x4 pile and then walk around and drag to it day of. But if you also don't be afraid of some of that larger permitting. Air quality will actually tell you that larger piles have less emissions because they can get really hot. They're also often less risky because there's a lot less total perimeter and you only have one to look out for. So I actually remember getting called to a fire one time that someone was convinced was a broadcast burn. And it was actually that someone had taken the rules very seriously and had created, probably 60 4x4s. And it was basically area ignition by the time they lit all their 4x4s. So bigger piles are going to produce less smoke and they're easier to watch. And I think kind of the take home is, these permits seem really intimidating, but they're you get your smoke management for 5 years, and in terms of like a larger residential style, a large pile, you're going to get support from air quality in making that happen. And in the terms of your LE7, they just want to see that you've built some line around the pile, is what they're going to want to see. And they'll come out and look at it once and maybe twice, and eventually you'll build a relationship. Maybe you kind of build your pile in the same place every year, and keep bare dirt around it, and it won't be a big deal to have bigger piles. On the smoke question, I think that's on the smoke question next to the road. I think it's another place where it's like we shouldn't shy away. There's no place more important to be doing, I guess, other than right next to your house. The next most important place to be doing fuel work is right next to the road. And so, having a couple people with some training from local fire, capable of doing traffic control, even, you can, as Mike was saying, you can plan your burn to lift your smoke. And you can use our capacity and with meteorology to lift your smoke. But it's always good that's kind of why prescribed fire is often better than wildfires, because we can plan for it and can have contingency plans, and putting a couple of people on the road to either start doing one lane traffic or try to divert traffic if you smoke out the road. And then also that's part of your plan. You say, if I start smoking on the road, I'm going to cease ignitions. If I see, smoke laying down, I'm going to perhaps increase my firing to try to lift my smoke. So there's a lot that you can use the tools of fire to make calls mid burn operation.
Yeah, and that's a good point that Kyle made is try to have the local fire district or fire department involved in as many projects as you can. They see it as a great training opportunity for a lot of their volunteer firefighters, and they'll provide help and resources that otherwise you wouldn't have. And so if you can kind of engage them in the process, and they are oftentimes very interested and excited in helping out. And so they can, provide that resource that helps you scale up or helps you get it done in maybe more confident way. But definitely consider including them in your planning. They're a valuable resource. Either they can help with the planning process and maybe helping you navigate permits, or they just can be resources for day of implementation. So they're a good partner in this process. Anything else? I mean, kind of, this is one of those things where we can talk about it all day, but the best way to learn it is to navigate the chaos yourself and figure out what it takes. And as you become more familiar with it and the agencies that you're dealing with become more familiar with you, it does get easier, right? They have more confidence in your abilities. You get more confident. And so it kind of helps build this positive feedback that, as you do this more and more, you get kind of more confident and it gets easier and easier in time. Anybody else have
The thing
questions?
that I think really intimidates people is the questions of fuel loading. I remember when I first started filling out those permits, I thought that they wanted me to go, somehow meticulously measure every acre of unit. But maybe we could talk a little bit about, I sent you an emissions table that I use, and then that East Bay photo document from the Forest Service, I think are kind of like the two best resources to fill out that number. I think the really important thing when you're thinking about that number in your smoke management plan is, if you are directly next to a hospital, fire might not be the right tool. And so, but for the rest of us, when they find out that you're out Elkhorn Road, air quality is not particularly concerned. Their job is to be sort of the gatekeepers of the sensitive receptors, and by that they mean hospitals, schools. I'm not sure the full list of other things they look at, but they run a really basic computer model that looks at the plume. For my biggest burns, they're actually worried about me smoking out Lake County more than closer to here, because I'm going to be burning on good lifting heights, and their job is to kind of be keeping the larger questions in view, where even though maybe I'm burning on a date that I've observed here in Potter that it's going to lift out, that doesn't mean it might not settle back in someplace else. So that's kind of air quality's job, and it's not really our job as permit application people. We don't run those models, but they do ask you to kind of guess how much fuel is out there.
Kyle, how can you do that in advance? You have to get your permit, you have to get your plan in advance. And how do you know what the winds are going to be doing?
So you as part of your burn plan, you set parameters of what types of days you'll burn on. And so the smoke management plan may say, if the sensitive receptors are to the west, they might ask you to burn on a day where the wind is coming from the east. And you try to set those parameters as wide as possible, but then you respect those limitations. And in some cases, that's also, part of your burn planning. You will set particular parameters, but that plan itself is going to be more detailed than your smoke management plan. But your smoke management plan may also set certain parameters as far as mixing height, and they'll give you recommendations of what sort of what to look out for in your weather forecast to know it's a good day to burn that unit. Which is why I think a really important thing when it comes to burn planning is to never think about just planning one burn. I'm always trying to think about what's a good fall burn, winter burn, and spring burn, because every year is going to be different, and especially spring burning, you don't want to get your hopes up too much. After May 1st, CAL FIRE is going to need to come and inspect your unit and give you an LE7, LE8 for it, which is going to define the resources needed to be on site for the day of that burn. And if your LE8 says that you need CAL FIRE support and there's fires happening someplace else in the state, they may withdraw that support. And so, you don't want to just be sitting around until the next spring hoping for a spring burn. You want to be at that point really starting to think about your fall burn.
some of you, the participants indicated that you have experience. Would some of you share some of the struggles perhaps, or the questions that your own experience brought to mind? I'm looking at you, Nancy.
Bobby takes care of everything. My cousin takes care of everything. So we out here, in fact, I'm gonna call into Boonville, to CAL FIRE in Boonville and see if we can continue on this weekend. The weather looks okay. And we've still got some areas that we want to work on. And they're not huge, but they're just in places that that we'd like to continue clearing a little bit. But for the most part, my cousin takes care of all the paperwork, so I don't have to.
Lucky you.
Yeah, you've got cousins like that.
I have cousins too. Are there other questions? I think Mike and Kyle are both waiting to answer your questions out there. There's
Kristen, I just looked it up. I don't think Mendocino has any requirements on outer edge clearance. It looks like the city of Redding's burn permit requires 10 feet of outer edge clearance for a 4x4. So that would put your individual 4x4 piles, 20 feet apart. That is something that I think, you can see a lot of these Forest Service projects, and some of the EQIP projects will end up with a really amazing density of 4x4 piles. And, that's where you want to, whatever you do, you want to have enough room that if both piles were on fire, you could be in between them, putting each one out if you needed to. So whatever that space, I guess, depends on, what type of fuel you're burning. But that's why I think that not being afraid of getting the smoke management plan to have at least a 10 by 10 or something is probably a better plan than making those a ton of little tiny ones like I've seen before.
Got it. Thanks.
Mike, could you bring up Heidi has a question.
Yeah, please. I'm hoping to do a controlled burn on some BLM land here. It's horribly overgrown, very mountainous, but that involves the federal government, of course, Bureau of Land Management. What sort of additional hurdles are there when you involve the feds?
They operate under a completely different permitting structure. They still have to abide by air quality restrictions, but they, burning on federal land triggers NEPA and has a whole different requirement based on the available resources. Working on federal land around here is challenging because our federal lands aren't heavily staffed and resourced, and so it can be pretty difficult to organize those kinds of projects. Though BLM, I was at a meeting the other day, and our regional BLM has really indicated they're going to step up their their active stewardship of the lands they're responsible for. So I don't know what that means. I know one way to work around that, if you not as private landowners, but what we're seeing happening in these good neighbor authorities, where you have something like CAL FIRE or some kind of state agency helping to manage federal lands through an agreement, at least the boundary between like the state and federal land. And that's one way that the Forest Service has increased capacity of stewardship, is that they're allowing other agencies that come in and manage those spaces. I couldn't tell you what it would take to burn BLM land here. That's going to be an interesting challenge. I don't know their process. They have a completely different kind of planning process, and I don't know it that well to understand kind of what the challenge.
Okay, but it sounds like the first step might be to talk to my CAL FIRE unit forester and see if they're interested in the project, and then go in together as a team to BLM.
Maybe. I don't know, under federal under emergencies, you see state and federal agencies collaborating, but I don't know if they're like prescribed burn, if CAL FIRE would be willing to, do that work.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, do you work for BLM? Are you?
No, I'm a small nonprofit back in the backcountry, and I'm starting to do
I
a
got
lot
it.
of
Okay.
work with various, like with Mendocino County Fire Safe Council and other groups to reduce ladder fuels and make this backcountry area a lot safer to be in. And we have a few mountain peaks in here that are on BLM land, and so we're looking to reduce the fire severity in those areas.
So I would say one project that I would, I can put you in contact, Mary Maeda with the NRCS. Before that, she was with the Mendocino RCD. She got funding to do a project up in the Los Usal area where they're doing shaded field break and roadside vegetation management across Usal Forest, which is Refuge Community Forest,
Right.
industrial land, and BLM land, and like county and private land. And if I remember correctly, the kind of contribution from BLM was they did the NEPA and it said, cool, here's the NEPA, go ahead and do the work. So I would start with contacting, if you haven't already, the local BLM reps and understanding what their kind of capacity is and what their comfort is with fire as a potential tool. And then, looking at those avenues that they have to allow other agencies to kind of work with them to implement stewardship.
Yeah, I've heard through the grapevine that to approach the BLM manager for this area, it's good to have all your ducks in a row. And so I'm in the process of lining up my ducks. And this is very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just, little word of caution, I would not talk to CAL FIRE first and say, hey, would you treat BLM land, and then go to the BLM manager, right? Because there's going to be that jurisdictional kind of, what do you want to call it? They're going
Interest.
to be, yes, they might be a little insulted if they're not consulted first, but definitely maybe reach out to me offline and I'll put you in contact with Mary, and you can, and maybe she can help you understand what she did to pull off what is frankly a pretty impressive project across a large diversity of landowners in that space.
That would be marvelous. Thank
frankly,
you.
BLM doesn't have a lot of money to implement stewardship, so they do rely on partnerships, but I'm not sure they will need NEPA. I don't know how they feel about using fire as a management tool, especially if it's not a federal, NWCG or certified burn boss in there under their resources. So fire might be more challenging, but just starting the process of vegetation management might be something as a conversation and a process that can start.
Copy that. Thank you.
Mike, can you bring up a sample of a burn plan, a template? I don't know whether, I don't think everybody has had experience, if I recall looking at.
Yeah, let me pull up. I don't have any redacted completed burn plans, so I'm gonna pull up the template, the California.
It's the template.
Yeah. Let me just navigate to that real quick. There are some, so if you go on the CalPBA website, there is an example of a burn plan that has been redacted and is posted. It's for grassland, but it's still, it's available. Okay,
Mike put his email address into the chat. And Peter, you put in Howard Forest Dispatch. Is there a specific reason you did that?
Just so someone mentioned calling Boonville Fire Department, and I just figured to do that for everyone.
Well, can you say a little bit more about that? I think I know where you're going with this, but can you say a little bit more about?
Yeah, whenever I put down fire, I've been in the habit of calling the dispatch because where I am towards Covelo, they're the ones that would get the call first and then send it to the Cal Fire station in Covelo. And so I just been making a habit of calling them, letting them know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I recommend. I think that's a really appropriate strategy. You work with your local battalion to help kind of navigate the permitting process and what they're comfortable with. But then as soon as you, on a permissible burn day and everything's, all your permits and everything are in place, like calling dispatch to let them know that you're burning, so that they know when they start getting, because they will, because it happens every single time. They know that when they start getting calls about a potential wildfire or some fire risk, they know that you are burning, and then they can respond appropriately. So letting Howard Forest or your dispatch, like St. Helena or Howard Forest, wherever you are, know that you're burning is a really important kind of communication tool to help build confidence. So I'm going to share my screen. Is that it? Yep. Okay, can you see the California standardized prescribed fire plan? Is that what everybody sees? Was a Word document?
Yes.
It's pretty easy. Those of you who've done it, there are a couple tricky spots that you might need help navigating, or you might have to kind of see some examples to explore. But basically, you just kind of identify the project. If you have a burn boss, so that's a California certified burn boss. Who's writing it? Agency having jurisdiction, and there's always like some question about what that means. But in this case, I think it's the oversight fire agency, so Cal Fire, your local fire district, property, all that stuff. You want to describe your project. Makes sense. The things that might affect fire behavior. And this is really important that you're not just focusing within the unit, but you're also talking about what's outside the unit, right? Because within the unit, that's where we're planning to burn. So that's where we're doing our treatment, our pre-treatments, or where we're thinking about fire behavior. But we really want to pay attention to that. What happens if we have an escape or a slop hole where we have some kind of incident where the fire leaves the unit, the management unit, and then we have to figure out how to respond. So we want to make sure we know what kind of vegetation or fuel we have in those spaces as well, so we can respond accordingly and have the right resources in place. Goals and objectives is all pretty straightforward stuff. Like, why are we burning? Things that we need to think about, like resources that we'll have, access, all that good stuff. Our units are established. How are we going to hold the fire if we need to? This is the one that you kind of needs a little bit more experience of kind of burning, and maybe some being able to look up, do like spot forecasts or look up meteorological data. But you really need to establish your prescription. And this is highly variable based on your vegetation type, time of year, your goals and objectives. But you need to identify this prescription window. It's a range of temperatures from your minimum to your max. So the cooler side of burning, and then the hottest conditions you want to burn under, and then what your target is. So identifying those data are really important, because these are the stuff that CAL FIRE is going to look at and really question, like, if your max temperature is like 80 degrees and your RH is like 9%, they're like, no, that is not going to happen. So understanding what these ranges need to look like for different types of vegetation is really important. And these are things that the PBA we can talk with you about, or there's other folks out there who can help you kind of navigate this process. Smoke management plan in place. Cool. It's just kind of like, hey, do you have these? Check it off. If you don't need it, or you have it. Your ignition plan. So how you plan to actually burn the unit. If you're going to be using a firing boss, so the person who's in charge of ignitions. That's kind of stuff that somebody with more experience will help you write. Or once you gain experience, you can understand what you need. Holding, just as important, right? Your firing is really important, but to keep that fire in the box, you need to kind of establish what your resources are for holding it in the unit. Sometimes it can be like, well, I know it's going to be a vegetation change, and this burning in this vegetation, it's really cool and wet, so it's going to kind of self-regulate. Or I need to really have a line there and make sure I have resources in place. So thinking about fire behavior, are you going to head fire? How long are your flames? Are they going to reach up into the canopy or that kind of stuff? How fast are they spreading? So rate of spread. These are things that we are thinking about when we're doing this. What else? Post burn.
And those are, Mike, to clarify, those are things that you'll either need to learn how to use a free program called Behave Plus, or you'll have to work with someone that knows how to use it. Once again, it's kind of intimidating, but it's just like basically a spreadsheet-based computer program.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, thanks, Kyle. Yeah, I'll send you the link to the tool, but you run these through a model based on the prescription and the vegetation type.
And that's a computer model that's been developed very specifically for kind of big fires and big decisions. And we're kind of taking it and trying to use it for prescribed fire.
Oh, you're chopping up, Kyle, but basically what he's saying is it's kind of like trying to shove a square peg through a round hole. It's not ideal, but it's the tool we have, and it's what we use at the current time. If you come back, you can continue explaining. But yeah, it's kind of what we have, so it's what we use. And then post-fire activities. These are really important. It's not just thinking about burning at the moment, how are we burning and making sure we're achieving our goals and objectives safely, but how are we going to follow up and make sure we monitor the burn, that it's staying inside the unit, that we have the right resources in place in case something flares up or gets hot. Mop up, meaning are we going to make sure that there's no hot zones on the edge of the unit so that's contained inside. Things that I think about, like not just in the moment, but a couple weeks out, especially if we're burning in an ideal burn window where it's like great temperatures, great humidity, low winds, but all of a sudden we know that in like 10 days we're going to have a big wind event and it's going to be drier and warmer. We need to make sure that we're planning for that and that we have the right resources and we kind of close out the burn appropriately so that we're not worried about the potential risks that could create. A big one in this process is notifications. You got to talk to your neighbors. You got to make sure to reach out to your, you're already talking to air quality and CAL FIRE and all those folks, but communication is crucial. If you're not communicating effectively, it's going to be harder to burn. We changed the language in the state of California to gross negligence around prescribed fire, but that still means you have to do your due diligence and communicate effectively to make sure that everybody's on the same table, everybody's at the table, so that they know, like, if you have a prescribed burn and you're doing the best you can and things will get a little spicy, as we say, CAL FIRE can help with that without following up with a bill because it potentially turns into an incident. So making sure you're communicating with everybody is really important.
And Mike, am I wrong about this? But I think that it's still a simple negligence for non-burn bosses. If you don't have, isn't that how that law was written?
I thought it was
gross negligence.
I thought it was gross negligence in general, as long as you're following all the permits and regulations, but I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that. But you could be right, Kyle. I could be wrong.
Okay.
What he's saying is that if you're a burn boss, either the new California certified burn boss or an NWCG, which is a federally recognized burn boss, then if you have a prescribed burn that turns into an incident, as the entity responsible for that project, it's gross negligence, which requires a bigger level of negligence than just simple negligence to be found responsible and liable. So I apologize for not being clear on that, and I'll try to get you an answer in a little bit. But yeah, I know it sounds scary. It's like we're just pointing out these things are kind of pretty intense, but it's really not that bad. This is just being really smart about planning and having everything in place so that you're confident and moving forward. Other really good things that have that these are more advanced, but like medical plans and other things that should somebody get hurt that's helping on a burn, that you know how to respond. So making sure, like, hey, our medical plan is to call 911 and get an ambulance or the fire department here as fast as possible. But thinking about these other types of documents and activities that you should undergo is a pretty good practice too. And I would say that a lot of this, maybe if it's new to you, that's great. It was new to me at 1.2. Participate in prescribed burn association projects, right? That's a really great way to like get exposed to completed documents. And with folks who are on this call or when you engage with other parts of the community that have been through this, it's a great way to learn and kind of get experience to this stuff so that you understand like what it takes to fill it out and what you need to kind of complete these sections. Any questions about this? If you haven't seen it before, it's a lot, but once you start teasing it out, it's not too bad.
To get help with some of it, as you were saying, I think you said that the PBA would be a place that they could kind of help you figure out how you describe the slope, for instance. What do they want to know? It's steep, or they want to know how many degrees? to talk to
Yeah.
your PBA about it. Okay.
Yeah, the PBA will help you, and then participating in projects is another great way to learn because you'll see these documents.
Okay.
So you'll get examples of them and understand kind of what goes into writing them.
I think of all the biggest thing that before the PBA gets involved is in firefighting. We talk about ridges, roads, and rivers. That's where you want to stop fires. And so, when you're writing a burn plan and you're drawing up your burn unit, you don't have to burn everything inside of it. So often if you want to do a burn that's going to involve getting CAL FIRE LE7, LE8 involved, I don't necessarily want to put a 10-foot dozer line into the middle of a grassland. But if I can draw a unit that is ringed by high quality roads, that's really where a lot of creativity can start happening inside of that unit. So and that means I was just out in Yorkville with two neighbors, and we were able to identify a really great ring road so long as we crossed both properties. Otherwise, there was going to be a steep fence line, some sort of hand line that just was kind of beyond what was going to be a very good idea. So really getting together with neighbors and identifying those ridges, roads, what areas that can ring a unit. That doesn't mean that you're going to light the whole thing on fire. But that's like the first step is to get that really contingency line together where you can feel, with 100% certainty that very limited resources under those shoulder season light burn conditions that we're talking about burning with the PBA, you're going to be able to control it there. So once a group can get together and come up with a shape like that, everything else kind of falls in line.
There must be other questions. You've got great experts here to answer your questions.
I've got a question. Can you talk a little bit more about, I guess, like ways that you have written burn plans to sort of give more flexibility for permitting, or kind of like along the lines of what you were just talking about, Kyle, with like identifying maybe like ways to make the permitting process smoother before you actually get there, sort of planning the burn and communicating with neighbors, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we should probably take that burn plan and reorder it kind of into a beginner version, so that because I know I've like right now I've been reviewing other people's burn plans, because if I sign off on it, then they have a different liability situation if I've put my signature on it. And so, my biggest concerns are always about the neighbors and the contacts and the community. A lot of that behave plus computer modeling, is kind of interesting, and it makes it seem like the burn boss really knows what they're doing, but it's that relationship building with the neighbors, identifying, especially as a firefighter, you have smoke on a hill. If you take the wrong access road, you can end up having to go back down to the bottom up a different access road, and that's a really common experience as a volunteer firefighter. And so what I really want to see is how if it starts going up that hill, what's the way to get there? And then how do we make sure that everybody up to that road it's going to get to is on board? And if they're not on board, that's where the Fire Safe Council and coming together around agreement around doing something about the fuel. And that doesn't mean that every single person inside of that ringed road is going to do the same thing. But that means that when you get CAL FIRE there, you can get an LE8 for the unit that is contained all the way to the ring road. And then inside of that, you could burn 1 acre of a 100-acre ringed road unit that you drew. There's no, once you've made a burn plan, there's nothing that says that you have to burn the whole thing. But once you can get that ringed road, ridge-lined road network together, that's where also CAL FIRE is very interested in, parking an engine at the top of that hill, especially outside of the seasons that they're going to be, potentially go on calls. But then even as they start to hire more people, a lot of those people have never had the opportunity to, maybe even see how fire moves across the land. And we'll have a lot of support. But the best way to utilize that support is at the top of the hill where the fire is going to go to, rather than everybody crowded right around a small unit. So I think that's where, once that they've come and they've, inspected your ringed road the first year, and then the weather doesn't line up and the fire doesn't happen, you kind of have that same basic LE7, LE8 that you're going to try to get again next year. And, they might say, scrape the grass out of the middle of your road if you tend to drive, all on the same track. I personally try to drive different tracks so that by the time it's spring, I've killed the grass on the road and I've got a good ringed road unit. So I think, kind of thinking about bigger burn units, but then only doing small pieces of them. Then that smoke management plan is also good for 5 years. You just renew it again, and it doesn't need to be a lot of paperwork every year once you get that kind of master plan together.
Any other questions out there?
I'm just going to say awesome job, Mike and Kyle. Thank you very much.
Do you have anything you two want to say to wrap it up?
The PBA, we have some grant funding right now. So if you're in the process of going through your grants, reach out to us. Going through your permitting and your plan writing, contact us and we can try to help in whatever capacity we can, and maybe put some time into it. Some site visits, and maybe even help you start thinking about how to write your burn plan. Otherwise, just start getting engaged in the community, whether it's, the Mendocino PBA, or if you're from a different county or interested in working with different groups like Terra or the Good Fire Alliance in Sonoma County. Just start engaging in projects, and that'll be a good introduction to understanding the process, what it takes to kind of implement prescribed burning, and what the permits look like. So yeah, it's a really hands-on learning experience for folks. So yeah, definitely get involved. I think that's a really important part of this process.
Mike, if people wanted to learn more about cultural
Thanks for being here. Yeah.
If they wanted to learn more about cultural burning, would Terra be another resource for that, or is there something else that would be better?
I think Terra's for a local partner who's been doing some projects. They're great. For like a really great program, I would look at some of the work coming out of like Humboldt and Trinity County. So like the Karuk and some of the projects, they've been doing prescribed fire for a long time and have some really awesome projects established and really good kind of literature and education around it. So they're a good resource to look at for the cultural elements as well. So there's good examples, and there's continuing to be more and more. So it's up to the community though on deciding what they're willing to share. That's kind of the thing about cultural burning, is that it's a cultural resource, so they're not always willing to be very public about it. So you're not always going to be engaged or know about it because it's a resource for that community, and whether or not it's open to the public or they're willing to share that information depends on each community. So just kind of keep your eye out and see what's available. Yeah, Heidi.
Yeah, and speaking of cultural burning, my understanding is that there is some sort of procedural easing if we go with a burn tribe, a tribal burn unit. Could you speak to that and what the difference is between a cultural burn and a regular burn when it comes especially to permitting and
Yeah,
regulatory compliance?
sure. I'm not in a lot of detail, but the latest round of legislation, and I don't remember the SB numbers, whatever it was, basically said that cultural burning is an important and valuable resource for the tribal communities. And so if they're a cultural fire practitioner and they have the capacity within their community to do fire, then it eases the burden of implementing those projects, right? You don't necessarily have to go through the same rigorous permitting process that we do. Theoretically, from my understanding too, is that if you are working on a project that say is not on tribal lands or is say on a private property and it's for a cultural resource, then you could have a cultural burner or cultural burn boss lead that project, and it changes this, it induces the same kind of regulatory relief to make sure that is an accessible tool for the Native communities. I don't know of any examples where that's been implemented, but the language as written makes a distinction between using cultural burning and prescribed burning for different goals and objectives. As far as what makes cultural fire different from prescribed fire, that's really kind of not my place to say. That's really up to the community to decide what is a cultural project. But just like examples or anything you can think of, like acorn resources or any kind of resource or thing that might be important for the community is kind of considered more cultural than just fuels reduction or using fire to kind of turn a disturbance regime. It's a fire to now we're kind of defining different goals and objectives within that space, and it's changing pretty quickly. Kyle, did you have thoughts on that? I don't know if I did a good job, but
yeah, I was just looking up SB 332, which is the gross negligence shift. As most bills are, it's not completely clear. It says existing law requires the agreement to it says that you do need. I lost where it said it, but it does need to be. This bill would provide that no person shall be liable for any fire suppression or other costs otherwise recovered for a prescribed burn if specified conditions are met, including among others that the burn be for the purpose of wildland fire, hazard reduction, ecological maintenance and restoration, cultural burning, silviculture, or agriculture, and that when required, a certified burn boss review and approve a written prescription for the burn. As far as I understand, the way all this kind of went was that at that point, cultural practitioners got involved and said, "Hey, we need a pathway too." And the government kind of said, "Okay, well, you're then kind of co-equal so long as you're designated as a cultural burner by your tribe, you're co-equal and you have the same benefits as this new state certified burn boss concept." I think one thing that is important for everyone to realize is that kind of the way that the law evolves is through lawsuits and through precedent. So like something like this is passed. If I lose a fire, I could very well still end up, in a long, lengthy, expensive, and life-destroying court situation. And theoretically, I will be pointing to this law, and at the point that someone who is a burn boss or a cultural practitioner goes through the process of fighting the state, then that case will be won, and then future cases will point to that and will become less expensive and problematic. So, I think that it's just the state, as far as I understand, did not do a lot of clarification about the definition of a cultural burner. And there's been as far as I know, no funding or any support to the tribes for tribal government to include in their ridiculously busy schedules any efforts to define this more. And so it is, we need to make sure that the people who may be willing to act as cultural burners are supported and protected legally, because there could be issues with that as well. I do know one person in the county right now. They lost a fire 3-4 years ago. All their neighbors are happy about it. Their neighbors felt like the fire did good things, but they are facing like a $1.5 million CAL FIRE bill for suppression costs. So those are all the things that this bill, theoretically, cultural burners are now won't be liable for suppression costs. But as all laws are, they do not, they kind of are like, it's kind of like clay, and then you put it in a kiln, and it hasn't really been put through the kiln yet. So one thing I tell people is, like, if we have like a 10-foot slop over, I almost want CAL FIRE to try to collect, so we can do, we can actually, maybe if CAL FIRE comes and ceremonially sprays with the fist pump, then we can actually put this thing through the kiln a little bit and harden it. But it is very confusing how the liability protection extends to cultural burners at this point.
Okay, and as a follow-up, the land I want to work on is heritage-wise considered Yuki land. Does that mean I need to find a Yuki burn group, or can I use, someone from the Pomo tribe or someone from the Karuk tribe to come and burn?
I am not sure the answer to the question from a legal perspective. And I think a lot of us are kind of in the process of understanding proper, good ethical behavior as it relates to ancestral tribal land. I think that the mentors that I would call to ask about that question would say that you should definitely reach out to Yuki government through Covelo Round Valley. In many cases, I think that what we need to be focused on in those situations is providing opportunities for experimentation and freedom. And that's where, finding really good, safe burn units is what it's going to take to get this, fire burning.
Thank you.
So if the land you're talking about is ringed by roads and has a ridgetop road, then definitely reach out to Yuki. In that case, I have written burn plans that then I don't even go to, because there's the legal protection behind the Cal State Certified Burn Boss written down stuff. I think is probably a good backup to have. And then you can also reach out to CAL FIRE, and CAL FIRE can park around the corner. There's ways to provide that level of sovereignty without putting people's liability at risk.
Thank you. Great answer.
Lawrence, I think you had a question.
Mine was a lot along the same lines as far as like what defines somebody as a cultural fire practitioner. And it sounds like that's not very clearly defined at this point.
It's not clearly defined, and it's a big problem. I became aware kind of in the background that there were some people in south of us wanting to do cultural burning on state park land, and they were not allowed to. And it turned out that all they wanted was a campfire. And state park thought that they wanted to, light a eucalyptus tree on fire. I don't know. So, I think that really it's too bad when those things fall apart just due to lack of communication. In this case, it was kind of like a beach fire that their elders could have easy access to. So, there are people up in Yurok territory for whom I think cultural burning means, bringing the salmon up the river by smoking the skies out and cooling the streams that we now understand was an important part of ecology here. And for other people, it might mean, lighting a small amount what would otherwise be called a campfire. So I think that it's all about providing that freedom and sovereignty and cultural space, and then having, fire professionals way in the background if that's needed.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? One more question. Well, not seeing any more. Mike and Kyle, thank you so very much, and thank all of you participants for your questions and your attention. And I think there's a lot that we have to learn, those of us that are starting on this journey, and you definitely pointed us in the right direction. And as I mentioned, I think I have everybody's emails. I will send you all kinds of stuff that they came up today so that you have ready access to the information and emails and URLs and whatnot that came up in the conversation.